Chapter 8, Radio Gimmick. Nancy's eyes sparkled with interest. You can explain it to someone who knows nothing about electronic engineering? Neil nodded. Sure, there's nothing very complicated about it. Do you know what a radio delay is? Not really. Nancy dimpled and shook her head. Okay, well, think of it as a kind of switch that turns something on and off. Only you don't have to push it with your finger, as you would a light switch. Why not? Because it's a remote control switch that's operated by a radio signal. You mean a person could be some distance from the carousel and start it and stop it that way? Exactly. All he'd need is a radio transmitter to beep out a signal of the right frequency. How far away would he have to be? Nancy inquired keenly. Neil Sawyer shrugged. Anywhere from a few minutes to a few miles, and even farther depending on how powerful the transmitter he used. And how big would the radio relay be? Very small. It would be attached to a magnet. It would be clamped underneath the operator's control box, and you'd never even notice it. Neil said that old-fashioned carousels dating back before the turn of the century worked by steam power, which was also used to pump the band organ that played the merry-go-round music. But nowadays, carousels are run by electric motors, and music comes from an electronic tape. The radio relay, he went on, would have two little wires with alligator clips on the end, so they could snap onto the wires coming out of the operator's control box. In other words, Nancy said, whoever played the trick would have to stick the relay in place underneath the control box and then clip on the two wires. Right. Even a kid could do it in seconds, and to remove it, he'd just unsnap the wires and pull off the relay. Teenagers and adults occasionally rode the merry-go-round. Neil guessed that the prankster could deftly attach such a device without being noticed, while customers were getting on and off the carousel between rides. And it could be removed just as easily the next day, or for that matter, during the night after the carousel had performed its spooky routine. Is there any sort of clue that might tell us whether or not a radio delay was used the way you described? Nancy asked thoughtfully. Yes, though I wouldn't call it proof, Neil replied. Some of the insulated covering is worn away from the wires that come out of the control box, and I noticed several scratch marks that might have been made by alligator clips. Nancy thanked the engineering student for his help. Neil's theory gave her exciting hope that she might now be one step closer to a solution of the haunted carousel mystery. Excuse me. Next morning, after breakfast, she called the red-haired girl who had come to her house. The phone was answered by a sharp-voiced woman. May I speak to Joy Trent, please? Nancy said politely. Joy's not here. Who's calling? Was the cut response. Somehow the woman managed to sound bossy, impatient, and inquisitive all at the same time. "My name is Nancy Drew. Joy left a message asking me to get in touch with her." "What's your name again?" "Nancy Drew." "All right. I'll tell her you called," the woman said grudgingly and hung up. Nancy put down the phone with a wry smile. Whoever the woman was, her telephone manner was anything but gracious. Nancy was about to turn away into the living room when the phone rang. She picked it up and the receiver again. Her caller was Ned Nickerson. "I'm back from Emerson," he reported. "How about lunch?" "Sounds wonderful," Nancy replied, her spirits instantly rising. "Where should we meet?" "You name it." "Well, let me see. I have to go to Riverside Park again." "Say no more. I'll meet you there. 11:30 be okay?" "Perfect." After hanging up, Nancy told Hannah Gruen her plans for the day. Later that morning, she found a space for her blue sports car in the parking lot adjoining the amusement ride area and strolled across the park toward the carousel. Excuse me. As she approached it, she saw a woman talking to the merry-go-round owner, Leo Novak. The woman, about 40, was attractive and well-dressed. She was showing Novak a piece of a paper that looked like a newspaper or magazine clipping. As she spoke, she gestured toward the carousel. Novak shrugged and shook his head in response. Nancy paused, not wanting to intrude on the conversation. The woman took a card and a pen from her purse. She wrote something on the card and handed it to Novak, then turned away. Nancy resumed her approach. By the time she was able to speak to Leo Novak, the woman was some distance away. "Do you mind telling me who that lady was?" Nancy asked the ride over. "Oh, just some busybody who's read all the hokum in the news about the haunted merry-go-round." Novak brushed her off queerly. Nancy noticed that he was wearing a large eye patch. "By the way, what's wrong with your eye?" she inquired sympathetically. Nothing serious, I hope." The owner seemed embarrassed by her question. Got a speck in it last night, that's all. This morning it was still sore. It'll clear up. "Perhaps you should see a doctor, Mr. Novak," Nancy advised. Then she told him Neil Sawyer's theory about how the carousel might have been turned on and off by a radio delay device. Leo Novak, however, scoffed at the idea. "No way," he retorted. "You can take it from me. If any gimmick like that had been planted under the control box, I'd have noticed it." Nancy was not convinced, but didn't wish to take time to argue. She was eager to find and interview the woman she had seen talking to the carousel operator. Nancy was intrigued by the way she had written something on a card and handed it to Novak, as if asking him to get in touch with her later. But why would she do that, Nancy wondered, unless her interest in the merry-go-round was more serious and more important than Mr. Novak cared to admit. As she turned away, Nancy caught a fleeting glimpse of the skin under the edge of his eye patch. It seemed dark and swollen. "Gee, I wonder if he got a black eye," she thought. If so, that might explain the look of embarrassment when she inquired about wearing the eye patch. Nancy scurried off, shading her eyes, to scan the throng of people milling about the park, but the mystery woman was no longer in sight. After searching the amusement park for a while, she gave up with a sigh. And glancing at her wristwatch, it was almost 11:30. Oh no! Ned may be waiting for me, Nancy reminded herself. Sure enough, Ned was in the parking lot. He waved as she approached and got out of his car to greet her with a kiss. How about the Limehouse Tavern for lunch? Nancy smiled. Fine with me. I'd love some fish and chips. The tavern, not far from Riverside Park, was run by an ex-London Cockney and his wife. Ooh, yes, I get to use my Cockney accent. Or at least, I think it's pretty good. I haven't run it by an actual Cockney yet, but from what I hear in media, it gets by. Nancy and Ned both loved its nautical atmosphere, reminiscent of an English dockside pub, and always found the food delicious. As they ate, Nancy asked, "Did you get your fall program straightened out?" "Yes, no problem. Which reminds me, do you remember Professor Jenner?" "Of course. You introduced me to him at the May Day ball. Teaches art history, doesn't he?" "That's the guy." Ned nodded. "He wants me to ask you a favor. Ever heard of an artist named Walter Cruz? The Western painter and sculptor?" "Right. In fact, he started out as a cowboy, I hear. Anyhow, the Prov's writing a book about Cruz. And he also caught a TV news report about you tackling the mystery of the haunted carousel." Nancy was amused and slightly bewildered. "I'm not sure I see the connection," she said with a chuckle. "There is one, believe it or not. It seems the news broadcast showed the carousel, including its name, the Wonderful Gallop, and according to Professor Jenner, Walter Cruz once had a girlfriend whose father owned that carousel." Nancy was surprised and charmed by this bit of information. She remembered reading that the artist had passed away a year or two ago. From her impression of Cruz's age, she guessed that Professor Jenner must be referring to the Wonderland's original owner, the man whom Leo Novak had once worked for. Ned related that the romance had occurred during a brief period when Walter Cruz was employed as an amusement park roustabout. Roustabout? Look it up later. Soon afterward, the artist had gone to New York and his work became famous. But for a while, he had kept up a correspondence with the carousel owner's daughter, in which he expressed his thoughts about painting and sculpture. "That's what Cruz once told the professor, anyhow," Ned concluded. "So now that he's writing a book about him, Professor Jenner would like to see those letters, if the owner's daughter still has them, and he's hoping you can help him get in touch with her." "I'll be glad to try," Nancy promised. Since Ned had to work that afternoon, he drove Nancy back to Riverside Park, where she had left her car. "I may as well ask Mr. Novak right now about the owner's daughter," Nancy reflected. So she strolled through the parking lot toward the amusement ride area. "Oh, Miss Drew!" called a youthful voice. Nancy turned and saw a pretty teenage girl with flaming red hair waving at her. The girl was hastily getting out of a sleek, powerful-looking foreign sports car. Nancy guessed at once that she must be Joy Trent, and suddenly she also realized why Hannah's description of the red-headed visitors had sounded familiar. This was the girl who had waved to her yesterday when she was chasing Finger Malone toward the haunted house. Chapter 9, A Nocturnal Break-In. Yes. It wouldn't be a Nancy Drew break. It would not be a Nancy Drew anything without a nocturnal break-in. The redhead girl hurried over to Nancy's car and said, "I recognized you from your picture in the paper. I'm Joy Trent. Miss Drew, I must seem like an awful pest." "Not at all." Nancy smiled. "I'm happy to meet you. I understand you have a mystery you'd like me to solve?" Joy nodded. "It will take a while to tell you about it, unfortunately. I have a meeting with our family lawyer in about 15 minutes. Could you possibly come to lunch tomorrow at my house? We don't live too far from each other." "Of course, Joy." Nancy assented. "That would be nice. Besides, we can talk a lot more comfortably there than we can in a parking lot. I live at 52 Sycamore Lane, by the way." Excuse me. With a grin and a wave of her hand, Joy went back to her car and then turned to call out, Around 12 be all right?" "Fine," Nancy responded. The red-haired girl slid behind the wheel with a soft, throaty purr from her car's powerful engine drove out of the lot. Nancy watched the sleek foreign sports model admiringly. Then she walked into the amusement park, hoping to find Leo Novak on duty at his cartel. As it turned out, she was in luck. The glum-faced concessionary looked none too happy to see Nancy, but when he found out she had come to ask him about the former owner's daughter, his manner loosened up, and he talked winningly. "Sure, I remember Nia Odin. Oh, okay. Pretty real girl. She and I were about the same age," he said nostalgically. "Wouldn't have minded going out with her myself. But old man Odin never paid me enough in those days to show her a real good time. Anyhow," Novak's lips tightened, "she kind of looked down on me." The name of the artist Walter Cruz, however, rang no bells in his mind. "I don't know anything about him, or any letters he wrote her. All I know is she got married to some guy she met in college and moved away. Last time I saw her was when Mr. Odin died. She inherited the Wonderland Gallup, so I bought it from her." Do you happen to remember her married name, or where she was living then?" Novak frowned thoughtfully, then shrugged and shook his head. "Afraid not. Sorry." Nancy was disappointed that she would not be able to provide Professor Jenner with any useful information. However, she felt that Nina Ogden's married name and last known address could probably be obtained from the official records of her father's death. The next morning, shortly after breakfast, Nancy received a phone call from an upset Joy Trent. "Our house was broken into last night," she reported. Side note, honey, it's probably because you just said your address out loud. I mean, aside from like a zip code, you basically said your address out in public for all the world to hear. And anyone can tell from that car that you got moolah lying around. Just saying, girl. maybe next time don't give your address out in public. Orally, anyway. Oh dear, I'm so sorry to hear that, Joy. Was anything taken? We're not sure. My aunt's checking now. Nancy, could you come a bit earlier than we planned to look at this? Maybe you can help the police in some way. Of course I can, Nancy said soothingly. Would 11 be all right? Thanks, that would be great. Joy sounded relieved as she hung up. Nancy had just turned away from the telephone when it shrilled again. This time her caller was Police Chief McGinnis. I've checked out the information for you, Nancy. About any trouble that occurred near the park at the same time the carousel played at night, there's only one case that fits, and that's the theft of a boat on the river. It happened just below the hill which the Riverside Park is located. Chief McGinnis added that the theft had occurred during the merry-go-round's last spooky outburst on Monday night, which was the same night that Nancy and Ned had kept watch. That's interesting, Chief, the girl sleuth replied. I suppose the police have the name and the address of the boat owner? Sure. Do you want the information? Yes, please. It might be helpful. Well then, here it is. Do you have a pencil and a paper handy? When Nancy said yes, he dictated the information. One last thing, Chief. A friend of mine just told me her house was broken into last night. The Trents on Sycamore Lane. Do you have anything on that? Hang on, Nancy, I'll see. A few moments later, the police chief hearty voice came back on the phone. Well, this may interest you, Nancy. It seems we got an anonymous phone tip about that burglary. The dispatcher sent a police car to the scene and apparently it interrupted the heist. But the crooks got away. Nancy thanked Chief McGinnis and hung up thoughtfully. That's odd, she said aloud. This was the second time in just a few days that the police had been tipped off about criminals who in some way were involved with her sleuthing. First had come a phone tip on Tuesday, which Officer Doyle had mentioned, about Fingers Malone and Baldy Krebs being seen in Riverside Park, and now last night there was another about the break-in at Joy Trent's house. And both tips had proven correct. Is there some connection, Nancy wondered, or is it just a coincidence? The second call, of course, could have been phoned in by some neighbor or even a passer-by who did not wish to become involved. Just then, Nancy heard the clock in the living room begin to chime the hour. She glanced at her wristwatch. Goodness, if she was going to pick up Hannah's order from the market before going to Joy's house, she'd better hurry. Quickly changing into a pale yellow-lined dress and a pair of white dress sandals, Nancy transferred her wallet, makeup, and keys to a slim white shoulder bag and set off on her errand. Some time later, having dropped Hannah's order off at home and left her note, Nancy was turning up the drive to the Trent's house. It loomed ahead beyond the trees and shrubbery. A large, impressive-looking stone mansion with a red tile roof. She had just come through an arching entrance gateway when a silver-colored two-door sedan passed her on its way. Nancy caught her breath and did a hasty double take. At the wheel of the other car was the same woman she had seen talking to Leo Novak at the amusement park yesterday. Nancy parked in the drive, walked up the stone steps of the house, and rang the bell. A smiling, silver-haired butler in a black uniform answered the door promptly and ushered her into a spacious, wide-windowed room with comfortable chairs and a baby grand piano. "Miss Drew, madam?" A thin, middle-aged woman with a disagreeable expression rose from the delicate writing desk and waved Nancy to a chair. "I'm Joy's aunt. I expect her back very shortly." I hope your friend didn't cut short her visit on my account," Nancy probed. "I saw a woman driving off just as I arrived." A flash of anger passed over her hostess's face. "She's no friend of mine, that troublesome busybody. As far as I'm concerned, she had no business coming here, and I've no wish to see her again." Chapter 10. The Iris Riddle. Nancy was surprised by the furious way Joy's aunt responded to the remark. So she did not pursue the matter, even though she was still curious about the visitor's identity and why she had come to call on the Trents. Luckily, the awkward silence that followed was soon spoken as Joy's car was heard pulling into the drive. The red-haired teenager came bursting eagerly into the house, having seen Nancy's blue sports car parked outside. "I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting, Nancy," she apologized breathlessly. "I expected to be back long before you arrived, but I got a flat tire on the way home." "It doesn't matter a bit, Joy," Nancy smiled. "I've only been here a few minutes." "You've met my Aunt Stella?" "Well, yes, though I didn't catch her name." "Mrs. Yawley," said Joe, performing a belated introduction. "Aunt Selma, this is Nancy Drew, the famous girl detective. I'm hoping she can help me figure out Daddy's last message." The woman inclined her head and shook hands coldly. "I'm never sure it's wise to discuss family affairs with outsiders," she murmured with an air of disapproval. "I trust you know what you're doing, Joy." Without giving either her niece or Nancy time to respond, Mrs. Yawley turned and left the room. Joy sighed, but managed to grin at Nancy. "Don't mind Aunt Selma. She's nicer than she seems. The only trouble is she treats me like a little backward child who can hardly be trusted to cross the street by myself." Nancy wondered if this meant Mrs. Yawley was Joy's guardian, but refrained from asking instead. She changed the subject and brought up last night's break-in. Joy related the burglars had evidently entered the house through the basement window, but had stumbled in the dark while coming up the stairs. The noise had awakened the butler, who slept on the ground floor. When he went to investigate, she said he was overpowered by two men in ski masks. One clamped a hand over the butler's mouth to prevent any outcry while he was being tied and gagged. After that, he could hear them moving around in different parts of the house. Joy went on. "But the police got here about 10 minutes later. I guess the robbers must have heard the scout car pulling up outside. Anyhow, they both got away without being seen or caught." "Do you know what was stolen?" Nancy asked. "Nothing. That's the funny part of it." "Are you quite sure?" "Oh, yes. Aunt Selma checked over every room." That is odd." Nancy frowned slightly. "Was anything out of place? Or was there any sign of ransacking? I mean, like drawers or cabinets being opened?" Joy shook her head. Not that any of us noticed. Why?" I just wondered if they might have been searching for valuables, like taking inventory first, deciding what to steal. But they got interrupted by the police before they could scoop up the loot. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. But there was no sign of that. In fact, there were valuables in plain sight, like those silver candlesticks on the mantel that they didn't even bother with. Have you any idea who called the police? Joy shrugged. Not really. I just assumed they were patrolling the neighborhood and noticed something suspicious. No, they responded to a phone tip, Nancy said. I have that from the police chief. Joy was surprised by this information and looked thoughtful. Nancy, this may not be important, but I have a hunch I was followed home yesterday after... that text scared me. There has got to be a way to put that on silent. And it's not even a proper text, it's like a separate app for, like, other kinds of messages. But anyway, there's got to be, like, somewhere in settings a way to put that on silent, because that scared me. Where was I? You mean another car followed yours? Yes, I kept seeing it in my rear view mirror. Oh, if that ever happens to me, I'm gonna lose my ever-loving mind. Even though I made several turns. Did you notice the license plate? No, I didn't even think of that, Joy said, regretfully. And also, you were probably, keeping your eyes on the road. It was a dark blue car. Maybe if I actually just, put my phone on silent, it'll calm down. Okay, it's still vibrating, but that's a little bit better. Okay. It was a dark blue car, and there was a man at the wheel. He zoomed on past after I turned off into our drive, so I never even got a good look at him. Joy Trent had been showing Nancy around the house while she told her about the break-in. But now the two girls settled themselves on the sofa in the sitting room to chat and get better acquainted. Joy revealed that she was an only child and an orphan. As Nancy had guessed, her father, John Trent, who sounded like a hard-driving business executive with little time to spare, had died several months ago. Yet despite his busy schedule, he had evidently been devoted to his daughter and had lavished a good deal of attention on her. Joy could not even remember her mother, who had died when Joy was a mere toddler. But the little girl had enjoyed a fond, close relationship with her father. Otherwise, she had been brought up by a succession of housekeepers and governesses until recently, when Mr. Trent's sister, Joy's Aunt Selma, became widowed and moved in to live with them. Nancy was still intrigued by the identity of the mystery woman, whom she had first seen at the park talking to Leo Novat, and then driving away from the Trent's house this morning. Could Joy's own visit to the park have had something to do with all of this? Nancy wondered. In view of Aunt Selma's harsh attitude toward the woman, she decided it might be better to probe the information in a roundabout fashion rather than ask a blunt question. By the way, Nancy remarked. I'm sorry I didn't respond when you waved to me at the park the other day. I'm surprised you even noticed me. Joy grinned. You seemed quite in a hurry. That's one way of putting it, Nancy said, with a chuckle. Actually, I was chasing a crook. She told the girl about her adventures with the pickpockets and then asked casually, Do you often go to the amusement park? Not really, though. I did when I was little. A reminiscent smile came over Joy's face as she went on. I love to ride the carousel. Daddy took me there whenever he could. In fact, he even brought me my favorite steed on the merry-go-round. Bought me my favorite steed on the merry-go-round. Really? Nancy was startled. Her sleuthing letters like rubbed off. Or is it? Sleuthing antennae instantly shot up. How did that happen? Well, at one time, the carousel moved away from River Heights. Yes, I know. There was one particular horse on it that I always used to ride, Joy explained. It was the lead horse, the most beautiful creature you ever saw. When I found out the merry-go-round was about to be taken away, I was broken-hearted, so Daddy made a deal to buy the horse from the carousel owner and wrote him out a check then and there. Nancy's eyes twinkled. You must have been a very pleased little girl. Joy laughed merrily. Oh, you have no idea. It happened that the next day was my birthday. Daddy ordered a van to come and pick up the horse in time for my party. My birthday celebration started right there at the park. It was quite an occasion. I can imagine. So this, Nancy's reflection, was why the lead horse had to be replaced. Why had Leo Novak told her a different story? Aloud, she asked, Do you still have the horse? Oh, yes, I'm too fond of it to ever give it away. Though right now it's at the River Heights Daycare Center. I lent it so the children who stayed there while their parents are working can have fun riding it. Joy told Nancy that before her father became head of his own machine tool company, he had started out as a lathe hand in a machine shop and was an expert handyman and mechanist. He mounted my horse on a special hobby horse stand that he made himself, so it would jog up and down when I rode it. The stand even has a music box inside that winds up and plays when the horse gallops. Sounds wonderful, Nancy said, dimpling. I'd love to see it. I'll take you to the daycare center sometime and show it to you, Joy promised. Anyhow, it wasn't until I heard about the haunted carousel on the TV news gallop that I realized Wonderland Gallop was back in Riverside Park. So naturally, I had to see it again. And then, of course, I read in the paper how you had agreed to try to solve the mystery, which is what gave me the idea of asking you to solve one for me. You've got me terribly curious, said Nancy. Tell me your mystery. Maybe riddle would be better for it, Joy began. Before she could go any further, the butler announced lunch, so Joy continued her story at the table. Just before my father died, she related with a slight catch in her voice, he told me he'd left something for me in the lower right-hand drawer of his desk in the study. This is what I found. She handed Nancy an envelope addressed to my darling daughter Joy. Open it. Nancy did so. Inside was a slip of paper bearing an odd message. Iris equals question mark equals Old Glory. How strange, Nancy murmured. Do you have any clue at all as to what it may mean? As Joy nodded in response, Nancy saw her eyes mist over. Iris was my mother's name. Nancy hesitated a moment. Do you have any recollection of her? None at all, Joy said sadly. I don't even know what she looked like. Daddy didn't even have a snapshot to remember her by. And he always regretted it. Said Yali, who was lunching with them, had been glowering at the two girls ever since they began their conversation. Now she uttered an audible sniff of disapproval. Is it really necessary to discuss all this with a stranger, Joy? The teenage redhead gave her a calm, defiant look. I invited Nancy here to help me find out what Daddy's letter means, Aunt Selma. I can hardly expect her to do that, can I, without her knowing a few facts about my family? The thin-lipped woman sniffed again and frowned irritably. But remained silent for the rest of the meal. Joy told Nancy that her parents had been young and poor when they got married. Her mother, unhappily, had not lived long enough to enjoy John Trent's eventful success, partly because he had no picture of his wife. Mr. Trent surrounded himself with irises in various forms. Oh, kind of cool, I guess. For instance, if you'll notice, Joy went on, this room has iris patterned wallpaper. After lunch, I'll show you some other examples. When they rose from the table, she led Nancy through several rooms, ending up in her father's study. In every room there was at least one bowl or vase filled with irises. There were also ceramic and glass likeness of the flower, wall paintings of irises, iris-decorated drapes, and numerous of other objects or furnishings. Your father must have cherished your mother's memory a great deal, Nancy murmured. Yes. Joy nodded and was silent for a moment, then went on. Yet because of his grief, Daddy could never bear to talk about her much, so I really know very little about her. I suspect one of these examples of the iris motif may hold the answer to that cryptic message he left you. Nancy mused aloud. But for the moment she was at a loss to unravel the puzzle, even though privately she had a feeling in the back of her mind that she had already sighted a clue somewhere in the house. So she asked Joy for a time to think over what she had just learned and promised to resume their conversation later. After leaving the Trent's house, Nancy turned to the amusement park. She went to ask Leo Novak why he had told her the lead horse was replaced because of breakage, when actually the original had been sold to Joy Trent's father. Ah, that was way back when the Trent girl was just a little kid, he retorted impatiently. It happened when Mr. Odin owned the carousel and the trailer. If you don't believe me, her dad had a photograph taken at the time. and gave Odin a copy. It's still stuck up on the wall of the trailer. I thought you wanted to know about the last time the lead horse was replaced. The truck accident I told you about happened after I took over the carousel. I see, Nancy said politely. Well, thank you for explaining that to me, Mr. Novak. Her next call was to the owner of the boat that had been stolen on the night she and Ned kept watch over the carousel. The owner, a gas station operator named Vic Marsh, told her he had been fishing on the river that night just below the park when suddenly he saw the carousel light up and start playing music. Startled me out of my wits, Marsh added with a chuckle. So I went ashore and climbed up the hillside to see what was going on. Later on, when I came down again, I saw those two guys making off with my boat. It was too dark to see what they looked like, but I yelled and went after 'em. It was 2 against 1, so I got rough up a bit. They knocked me down and shoved me off before I could stop 'em. Nancy's eyes widened as a thought struck her. The boat thieves could have been the 2 dark figures whom she and Ned had seen examining the carousel. Chapter 11. Romani Rendevinus. The more Nancy considered the question, the more certain she felt that the boat thieves were indeed the midnight intruders in the park, rather that ran out into one of the lighted streets that bordered Riverside Park on 3 sides. That's better. All right. And thus run the risk of being spotted and captured. They had cleverly made their gateway in the darkness via the river in the stolen boat. Excuse me. Did you ever get your boat back? Nancy asked Vic Marsh. Oh, yes. It was found abandoned the next morning. It was just a ways down the river. And where is it now, Mr. Marsh? Back on its trailer, in my driveway at home. How was it returned to you? She inquired. The gas station operator looked puzzled. I went, and I picked it up myself after the cops called me. Why? Because if no one else handled it in between times, it may still have the thieves' fingerprints on it. Vic Marsh's eyes lit up. Hey, that's a smart idea. Any objection if I ask the police to go to your house and check the boat? Be my guest. Nancy called Police Chief McGinnis from a booth just outside the service station and explained her notion. Right you are, Nancy. I'll send one of our experts out to dust for fingerprints this afternoon. The chief sounded enthusiastic. I'll let you know the results. Nancy drove directly home, hoping for a quiet hour or two in which to catch up on some chores. As she entered the house, the telephone was ringing. When she answered, a pleasant woman's voice asked to speak with Nancy Drew. This is Nancy Drew. That's better. Miss Drew, you don't know me, but I'm the woman in the silver car whom you saw driving away from the Trent's house this morning. Nancy felt a thrill of excitement, but struggled to keep her own voice calm and casual. Oh, yes, I remember. But how did you know who I was, or where to reach me? Because I recognized you from your picture in the newspaper story about the haunted carousel. I see. May I ask who's calling? There was a moment of hesitation at the other end. I'd rather not answer that question for the moment, Miss Drew, if you don't mind. It happens that I need your help. I wonder if I could meet with you somewhere. Nancy was only too eager to learn about her mysterious caller. When did you have in mind? She asked. Right away, or as soon as you possibly can, the woman answered in an urgent voice. Very well. Would you like to come here? Oh, thanks, but no. I prefer someplace else. If you could meet me at Romany Tier Room in 10 or 15 minutes, I'd appreciate it. Okay, I'll be there, Nancy promised and hung up. The Tier Room was located among a busy stretch of small shops on the fringe of downtown River Heights. After parking her car, she entered and saw the woman's caller waving to her from a small candlelit table by a big beige curtained window. It was very good of you to come, Miss Drew. The woman smiled and with a gesture of her hand invited her guest to have a chair. I must confess your call has made me very curious, said Nancy, sitting down. Small wonder. I apologize for being so mysterious, but as I said on the phone, there's a reason. May I assume you're a friend of Joy Trent? Yes, I am, Nancy answered. Then I'd like to ask you a favor. The woman indicated a white cardboard box bearing a florist's label that was lying alongside her purse on the table. Would you deliver this to Joy this afternoon? Nancy hesitated, troubled. She didn't know this woman, and no matter how nice she seemed outwardly, she might still mean harm to Joy. I don't mean to sound impolite or unfriendly, Nancy murmured aloud. But may I ask what's inside the box? The woman smiled. You're quite right to be cautious, Miss Drew. I don't blame you a bit. Then she lifted the cover just enough to show that opening it entailed no danger. But if you'd like to be absolutely sure, you can go and check with the florist. She indicated the name on the box and then pointed out the Tier Room window. His shop is just across the street. Nancy's slight, cautious frown relaxed into a sudden smile. She had decided to trust her own judgment of the woman's character. Very well. Oh, thank you, Miss Drew. My name and phone number are inside the box. Would you be kind enough to call me and let me know the outcome of the delivery? As Nancy said yes, the waitress came to their table carrying a tray of tiny fancy sandwiches, as well as cups, saucers, and a pot of steaming tea. I'm grateful to you for trusting me, Miss Drew. The woman's attractive face reflected Nancy's own smile. Now let's have some tea. 15 minutes later, Nancy parted from her mysterious new acquaintance outside the Romanian tea room. But instead of going straight to her car parked at the curb nearby, she stopped at an outdoor phone booth and called Joy Trent. "Hi, Nancy," said the red-haired girl. The red-haired girl responded. "Don't tell me you figured out my father's letter already." Nancy chuckled. "I'm afraid not, Joy, but something else has come up, something rather odd. I've been asked to deliver this package to you." "To me?" Joy sounded. "Who's it from?" "A woman who refuses to identify herself." Excuse me. The teenage sleuth briefly explained how the package had been entrusted to her. "Oh, gosh, now you've got me curious." "Could you bring it right over?" Joy begged. I'm practically on my way." Then when Nancy arrived at the Trent house, she found Mrs. Yawley on hand with Joy. Judging from her facial expressions, the tight-lipped woman was as curious about the package as her niece. Nancy debated briefly whether or not to mention that the woman she had met at the Romani tea room was the same person she had seen leaving the Trent's house earlier. But she judged it wiser not to bring this up for the time being. In any case, she had a strong hunch that Mrs. Yawley already suspected who had sent the package. Joy took the florist's box from Nancy and with bated breath untied and removed the cover. A gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes brightened with excitement. "Nancy! It's an iris!" She held out the box long enough to show its contents. Inside lay a purple flower and a folded note. Joy hastily unfolded and read the message, then handed it to Nancy. "If you care to get in touch with me, call the Regenant Hotel and ask for Mrs. Rose Harold in room 922. Here, let me see that," said Mrs. Yawley, impolitely snatching the note away from Nancy. "Golly," Joy blurted out, lifting the iris from the box. "This may mean she knows something about Mother, or about that letter Daddy left me. I'm going to call her right away." She started toward the phone, but stopped short as her aunt explained harshly, "Oh, no, you're not. The woman who sent this is obviously nothing but a fraud and a troublemaker. Joy, I absolutely forbid you to contact her. To contact that creature." Pausing for a moment. 10 cents says, "This lady..." I truly think she's actually related to Joy, but I think the only reason she adopted her is for the mansion and for the moolah that she inherited. She's just after Joy's money. I don't think she cares one little bit about her. She's definitely got, like, evil stepmother energy. So, yeah, I think she's just, like, here for the money. She's not here for actually raising Joy. That's my 2 cents. Chapter 12. Fog Curtain. Joy's eyes flashed rebelliously. "You've no right to take that attitude, Aunt Selma," she protested. "I've every right," Mrs. Yawley snapped. "Just remember, young lady, I'm your legal guardian. And maybe you'd better remember that Daddy's will said..." Joy's voice trembled with indignation. The thin-lipped woman looked her niece up and down scathingly. Just what are you referring to? According to the lawyer, Mr. Trimble, his will only names you as my temporary guardian, Joy pointed out, holding up the iris. So, don't think you can stop me forever from seeing the lady who sent this. You may not even remain my guardian until I'm 21. If it's true that redheads have hot tempers, thought Nancy. Joy Trent certainly looks the part at this moment. The young girl's cheeks were inflamed behind their sprinkling of freckles, and her bright red hair added to her fiery looks. Besides, Joy went on, it's absurd to forbid me to see someone who may be able to tell me about my mother, or help to explain Daddy's riddle. What harm can it do, for goodness sake, to hear whatever she has to say? Turning to her friend for support, Joy added, Don't you agree, Nancy? Before the teenage sleuth could reply, Selma Yowley rounded on her. You keep out of this, Miss Drew. You've caused enough trouble already by acting as that wretched woman's messenger. Nancy was not intimidated in the least by Mrs. Yawley's. Yeah, when you've been in the hands of murderers and cult leaders, yeah, older women who are just trying to control their adopted niece don't scare you in the least. Nevertheless, she thought it best not to take sides for the moment, even though there was no doubt where her own sympathies lay. Why not wait and ask me that question tomorrow, Joy? She suggested with a calm smile. Perhaps you'll both see things in better perspective then. In the meantime, it's late, and I'd better be getting home. It was hard to erase the unpleasant incident from her mind. However, at the dinner table that evening, she told her father what had happened and asked his opinion on the subject. What should I have done, Daddy? What did you feel like doing? Said Carson Drew, responding to her question with another question. Nancy chuckled. To be perfectly honest, I thought her aunt was behaving like a stuffy old witch, and I felt like telling Joy to use her own common sense and do just as she pleased. I mean, it seemed so unreasonable for Miss Yonley to forbid Joy even to speak to the woman. Nancy's smile faded and ended uncertainly. The trouble was, I just wasn't sure I had any right to butt in. What about her father's point of view? How do you mean? Inquired Nancy's, raising an eyebrow. Presumably, this John Trent must have been a pretty shrewd judge of character to be so successful. Wouldn't he have had good reason for naming his sister to be Joy's guardian? Perhaps he had no other choice. She may have been the only other relative he had. And Nancy, said Nan. Oh, that was Nancy talking right there. My bad. Perhaps he had no other choice. She may have been the only other relative he had, said Nancy. But anyhow, they say anyhow a lot in this book. Can I just say? That's just the point. According to Joy, the family lawyer, Mr. Trimble, said that her father's will only named Mrs. Yonley as Joy's temporary guardian, Also, that she might not continue as guardian until Joy was 21. Doesn't sound as if he wasn't wholly convinced Mrs. Yawley was the best choice.
You do have a point there. Mr. Joy sipped his coffee thoughtfully for a moment. And you say the lawyer's name is Trimble, eh? That would be Fred Trimble, I imagine. I've met him in court a few times. And at the Bar Association dinners. Let me sound him out about this, Nancy, and see what he has to say.
Oh, Daddy, if you could, I'd be so grateful. Can I just say, it's weird reading a character like Nancy calling her father Daddy. Maybe it's just because modern culture has painted calling your dad Daddy as like a bad thing. Like it's only like a thing that bratty kids do. Like girls who are like literally like daddy's girls who get everything they want from their dad. I feel like that's really the only people that in media who are like young adult women. I feel like that's the only young adult women you see in media, like calling their father Daddy. Maybe that's just me. But yeah. Also, I was gonna say something else, but what was it? Also, there seems to be like a trend in like Nancy Drew books of orphan girl having guardian. Guardian is a little ambiguous on whether they're really supposed to be the guardian or not, stuff like that. Anyway, it seems like guardian with orphan seems to be like a definite trend in these here books. And also maybe I should pause this here because we're getting kind of long and this camera has conked out on me before when I tried to record a lot of footage at once. I'll finish this chapter first though. Nancy had just helped Hannah clear the table when Bess and George arrived excitedly. Oh, Nancy, we're going to have a slumber party on the houseboat, and we want you to come. Please say you will. It'll be fun. Bess bubbled with enthusiasm and anticipation. Just the three of us? Just the three of us, Nancy. George chimed in. No babysitting tonight. The Clusters are staying at my house tonight, and Uncle Bill said we could sleep on the boat if we wanted to. What do you say, Mr. Drew? George appealed to a smiling Carson Drew. It certainly sounds attractive, he replied. Sleeping on a riverboat in good weather is very calming. I couldn't agree more, Dad. Nancy hugged him. Come on, kids, and I'll throw some things in my overnight bag. Nancy turned and ran upstairs, her two friends trooping after her in her room. Nancy took a small zippered bag from her closet and folded her night clothes into it. Then with George and Bess's help, she collected comb, brush, and toiletries from her dressing table. Minutes later, they had said goodbye to Carson Drew and Hannah Gruen and were driving off to the marina in Nancy's blue sports car. That evening had turned sultry rather unexpectedly, and by the time they reached the houseboat, the moon had disappeared behind a bank of clouds. Gee, I hope it doesn't rain, Bess said plainly. What's the difference? It'll just be more cozy. George laughed. Right, Nancy agreed. Don't worry, Bess. We'll be safely docked at the marina. Once aboard the houseboat, the girls changed into their night clothes and made cocoa, taking their cups out of the galley and going out on the small open deck. And the girls settled themselves in deck chairs and listened to the water gently lapping against the sides. At George's suggestion, they began telling each other's ghost stories.
A wispy fog drifted in from the river. The stories grew spookier and spookier. Finally, Bess called a halt.
If we don't stop right now, I won't be able to sleep for bad dreams. Let's go to bed.
Giggling, her friends agreed. Going back inside the cabin, they settled down in their bunk bed and one by one dropped off to sleep. Sometime during the night, Nancy woke up with an unpleasant sense of danger. What had wakened her? With a sudden gasp of alarm, she realized that the houseboat was in motion. She could feel the deck swaying to and fro beneath her, far more than would have been the case if the boat were still safe in its sheltered slip at the marina. It must have come loose off of its moorings, Nancy realized. We must be adrift on the river. Springing up from her bunk, she pulled on her robe and slippers and hurried out on the deck. As she shivered as the damp night air sent a chill through her body. Thick layers of the swirling mist surrounded the houseboat on all sides, and it was impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. Yet, despite the fog and darkness, there was no longer any doubt in Nancy's mind that the boat had come adrift. If they were still in their berth, a faint haloed glow should have been visible from the marina's dock lights. As it was, not even a glimmer pierced the dark, oily fog anywhere she looked. The distant hoot of a foghorn and the muffled clang of the ship's bell reached her ears through the billowing mist. The eerie sounds racked Nancy with a shrill of appreciation. Oh, what can we do? She asked herself. The first thing, of course, was to wake Bess and George. Then they'd better start the engine and try to... Nancy broke off with a sudden cry of fear as her eyes widened with fright. The high white bow of a good-sized motor cruiser had just loomed through the fog only a short distance away. The craft was bearing straight down for them.